Hello, I'm Kate Schaefers, Director of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of Minnesota. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's talk, which is part of our 2024 Great Decisions series. Our speaker today is Professor Christi Siver, and our topic is Science Across Borders. I'd like to start with our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose lands we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. So, about our speaker today, Christi Siver is Professor of Political Science at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. She did her undergraduate work at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon, her master's in International Relations and International Economics at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and her Ph.D. in Political Science at the University of Washington. She teaches courses on international relations and international security. Her current research interests include international humanitarian law, military technology, and comparative law. Today's program is brought to you through the co-sponsorship between Ramsey County Library, Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of Minnesota, Global Minnesota, and the Foreign Policy Association. We are deeply grateful to all of those organizations for their support in bringing these talks to our communities. Now I'm going to turn things over to our speaker, Christi Siver. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here. I enjoy working with Ollie and I'm really appreciative to be working with Global Minnesota. So today's topic is Science Across Borders, which really focuses on addressing the urgent threat of climate change. And there's just no way of getting around it. We know that climate change is a very serious issue and that we will have to address it sooner rather than later. So the current threat of climate change is so urgent that scientists and policymakers are considering quite extreme solutions. And one of those solutions is pictured here, was inspired by the 1991 eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines. This eruption, which you can see was quite violent, expelled a lot of sulfur dioxide particles into the air, which actually resulted in global cooling of about 1 degree Celsius. Now, that has inspired scientists to think about how could we potentially put particles into the stratosphere that might block some of the sun's UV rays and thus create some cooling to help us address climate change. I'll talk to you a little bit more about why I think that that is something we want to really consider carefully and not necessarily jump to that solution. So today what I'm going to do is first talk about the problem. How much time do we have to address climate change, and what is the nature of the threat? Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the tragedy of the commons. Of course, our atmosphere is a commons from which we all benefit, but we also contribute CO2 emissions at very different levels between different countries. And then does finding some kind of technological solution create a moral hazard where we kind of chase these techno fixes in place of what would probably be CO2 emissions reductions, which will be a lot harder, both politically and economically and technologically, but that also will get more at the root of the problem. Then we'll talk a little bit about solar radiation modification, which is the technological approach that was inspired by Mount Pinatubo, and a little bit about like what are the benefits and what could go wrong. Then we'll get to kind of the heart of the issue, which is when we're dealing with global policies like this that could have global consequences, who should really be in charge? And we'll go through a few different options. Finally, I kind of want to bring us back to who should bear responsibility for addressing the issue of climate change, and how do we kind of navigate that? And then I'll give us a few options of what we can actually do in our everyday lives and in organizations we can support to try and help people address this problem. So I think we're all pretty familiar with the threats of climate change, which include extreme weather, drought, flooding, melting in the Arctic and Antarctic, sea level rise, and the consequences that come with that. So this graphic from the World Meteorological Organization kind of simplifies that into one kind of graphic. And we know that this is a problem. We have just in the news seen concerns about higher ocean temperatures, the result of that being bleaching of coral reefs, which of course devastates those ecosystems. We also know that we're probably facing a very active hurricane season, and we also see droughts and flooding all over the world causing these extreme weather impacts. So we know that climate change is real, and it's something that we have to address. The unique problem that scientists are trying to use plans like solar radiation modification to address is this notion of climate overshoot. So you all probably remember in 2015 that the Paris Accord set a goal that countries should work to pursue efforts to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Now, unfortunately, a lot of countries haven't necessarily met this obligation. So a commission came together, which included leaders from all over the world, called the Climate Overshoot Commission, and they issued in a report that they argued it is almost inevitable that we will temporarily exceed this 1.5 degree threshold, but could return below it by the end of the century. You may have heard a report from February of this year of scientists who were polled about the possibilities of meeting this 1.5 degree target, and they are all very, very concerned that we will not only not meet the 1.5 degree target, but that we will blow by it significantly. Of course, if we have, in this graphic shows kind of some different scenarios. The first is a large overshoot. Now that is a possibility, but it's unlikely because we do have countries making strides towards kind of reducing CO2 emissions and getting back within that 1.5 degree threshold. Now, of course, the green is the best solution. There would be no overshoot. What scientists think is more likely is a limited and temporary overshoot. But even a limited and temporary overshoot, where we kind of overshoot the 1.5 degrees, but because of our CO2 emissions reductions, we come back under it, will still have pretty devastating impacts that could cause worsening effects on human health, food security, water availability, social stability, and ecosystems. No country would be spared, but the least industrialized countries would likely suffer the most. So the Climate Overshoot Commission really encouraged scientists and policymakers to think broadly about solutions, particularly ways we could try to cope with the possibility of overshoot. But when we look at CO2 emissions, they are increasing, and they have been significantly increasing since the Industrial Revolution. And this graphic just shows that kind of no matter who's contributing what, the world is increasing its CO2 emissions greatly. So the challenge is that all of us on the Earth share the same atmosphere, but some countries are contributing more to greenhouse gases than others. And those countries are effectively free riding, instead of us all conserving this common resource or all, shepherding this common resource, some countries are taking advantage of the fact that they can kind of get away with contributing more to greenhouse gases than others. And this is a challenge in dealing with the problem of climate change, because you can see here that even if the United States made significant CO2 reductions, India might say, well, why should we even bother? Because any reductions we make won't really matter. So when a public good is shared, everyone would be better off if the public good is conserved, but individuals have an incentive to free ride. And also, if efforts need to be taken to preserve the public good, everyone would be better if each individual contributed, but individuals can benefit from the preservation of the good without making a contribution. Of course, if enough people free ride, then we end up at the worst possible problem, which would be that massive overshoot we saw on the previous slide. So there's a disconnect between what is rational for individual countries and what is rational for the entire world. That brings us to a really central question when we're thinking about how do we address the issue of CO2 emissions and global climate change. And I really appreciate this photograph, which kind of helps remind us that the Earth is a finite space, it has finite resources, and it is relatively fragile when we think about it in the context of the broader solar system. And so, how we address this problem really gets at how you think about the Earth and its resources. Are resources finite, and thus the focus should be on emissions reductions, or can technology infinitely expand the Earth's capacity? If we take the risky bet that technology is the answer, what happens if we're wrong, right? And so geoengineering or solar radiation modification presents, some scientists argue, a moral hazard. They believe that geoengineering is a distraction from the more politically difficult challenge of reducing carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuels in agriculture. And solar radiation modification will only temporarily reduce the impact of rising emissions without tackling the root causes. So let's talk a little bit about what solar radiation modification actually is. So there are a number of different ways that we could modify the atmosphere. The first would be space-based methods, so putting kind of these sun shields out into space that would reduce the amount of the sun's UV rays getting into the atmosphere and thus warming the Earth. There are also the use of planes to inject aerosols into the air, very similar to the Mount Pinatubo effect, and that those would reflect UV rays. There's cloud thinning, and the creation of cloud seeding, which has been used already on a regional level, but these are all ways to try and create some kind of cooling in the atmosphere. The National Academy of Sciences did a report kind of looking at all of these different methods in 2021, and they argued that there was the possibility that solar radiation modification could reduce surface temperatures and potentially ameliorate some risks posed by climate change. It would cost about $100 billion to implement globally, which seems like a lot of money to you and me, but in the larger context of addressing climate change is actually seen as relatively cheap. The problem is it does not address the root cause of greenhouse gas emissions. Emissions would potentially continue to rise, worsening ocean acidification, and solar radiation modification would need to be continued indefinitely. And there's a huge risk that if you just stopped doing solar radiation modification kind of abruptly, you could get a snapback in temperatures because of all those UV rays are going to be coming into the Earth's atmosphere without any addressing the issue of greenhouse gas emissions and CO2 emissions in the atmosphere. So this will require, if done globally, which it would pretty much have to be done, would entail a massive industrial undertaking with scores and hundreds of planes, for example, deploying millions of tons of material in the stratosphere every day for decades from many bases around the globe. So this is really a very big undertaking that is something that we really need to think about before we consider this as the ultimate solution to climate change. So what could go wrong with this kind of plan? So the scientific community is currently debating the ethics and political issues. How do you manage the risk of experiments? And some scientists have argued that in essence, this is an untestable technology because to test it would be to deploy it. And what we've learned about climate science is that we actually know very little about the complexity of all of the different aspects and variables in the climate and how they interact. So a regional test of this might not be accurate, and we don't necessarily know how these particles would affect and and influence different regions. In fact, there is the possibility of severe droughts and almost total loss of vegetation in areas including Sudan, Chad, Senegal, Mali, and Niger. There's also the possibility of excessive cooling, continued disruption of oceans, and uneven benefits and consequences. The American Geophysical Union has warned that unintended consequences tend to be suffered most by those with the fewest resources and the least say. So there's a lot of concern in the scientific community about what solar radiation modification would look like if actually implemented. So who should be in charge of this kind of massive global scale project? And I'm going to talk to you about kind of 6 different possibilities, which would include international organizations like the United Nations, non-governmental organizations, and epistemic communities, which are really groups of scientists. Then we'll talk a little bit about states, thinking about the United States and other states that might have an interest in participating in this kind of activity, private actors, and then indigenous communities. So when we think about international organizations, I think the United Nations comes to the forefront of our mind. Now, already in 2010, the United Nations Convention on Biodiversity called for a global moratorium on major geoengineering projects, and this was reaffirmed by the UN Convention in 2016. So there's already, for some time, there's been concern about these kinds of projects. Actually, just in March of 2024, the UN Environmental Assembly, which was held in Nairobi, Kenya, rejected a resolution from Switzerland pushing for the adoption of kind of solar radiation modification research plan. While some scientists applauded the creation of a group to explore the possibilities of solar radiation modification, another warned that the risk of such an initiative is that it elevates SRM as a real solution and contributes to the normalization of something that is still very premature and hypothetical from a scientific perspective. You need to be careful about unintended consequences and consider the risks of opening a Pandora's box. However, there's also a lot of concern about whether the United Nations can actually control research into solar radiation modification. So some are really concerned, like, can the UN provide equitable and effective multilateral control over the deployment of this technology at a planetary scale? Now, other aspects of the UN, other bodies of the UN, are also concerned about the consequences of this kind of technology. In September of 2023, the United Nations Human Rights Council issued a report noting that new climate protection technologies, including solar radiation modification and carbon dioxide removal, interfered with the enjoyment of human rights, including the right to life, to a clean and healthy sustainable environment, to an adequate standard of living, to access to food and water, to access to justice and effective remedies. At this stage in their development, it should be presumed that all of these technologies were harmful to human rights. Well, I will note that just in the last week or so, the European Union has created a project called Co-Create, which will examine principles and guidelines for a possible governance framework for responsible SRM research. So while the United Nations has kind of taken a much more cautious approach, not really wanting to encourage the development of SRM research or technology, the European Union is maybe taking a different approach, saying if this is going to come down the road somewhere, we need to be more aware and we need to have more scientific understanding of it. And the European Union program has committed to include marginalized communities such as Indigenous people in the Arctic and communities in the Global South. So it'll be very interesting to see how this project evolves. In terms of scientific communities, there's a lot of division, but also a lot of unanimity in terms of caution. So, as I already mentioned, the American Geophysical Union, which is a US-based earth sciences organization with 500,000 advocates and professionals in the earth and space sciences, has called for an international solar engineering non-use agreement. So while they're very interested, they're like, okay, we're kind of okay with research, but they want to make sure that this technology is not deployed. And that will be really important when we talk about the role of the private sector, because the private sector is currently unregulated and they seem to be committed to forging ahead without answering the kind of ethical questions that the scientific community is concerned about. So science diplomacy, which is kind of centered right now on a moratorium on large-scale experiments. They are interested in expanding scientific research and pursuing international dialogues on governance, but they want to do that with justice in mind. So then we can come to individual countries. So Joe Biden, President of the United States, has actually done some research into looking at social radiation modification. Now, previously under the Trump administration, there was a lack of support for any regulation that might limit US companies developing these technologies. Biden asked the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy to weigh in, and they argued that a lack of country-level dialogue, governance bodies, and research norms might increase the possibility that state or non-state actors could move independently to develop and deploy SRM technologies. So while the United States is not actively moving forward on SRM as a technology that the Biden administration is kind of putting its stamp on, they are kind of acknowledging that this is a potentially problematic issue from governance standpoint and that we need to be paying attention to international efforts to perhaps rein in both research and deployment. Now, that is a fairly nuanced and kind of pragmatic approach. The question is, what would happen if someone like Vladimir Putin or China with Xi Jinping at the head were to move forward with solar radiation modification technologies, seeing a benefit for their nation state at the expense of others? So China's Xi Jinping has been reported to have said in an address to the Chinese Academy of Sciences that science and technology personnel must be spared from spending lots of time on needless socializing, unnecessary evaluation and assessment, or formalistic or bureaucratic events at any time. And so I think where we have some concerns here, right? While the United States might be taking a more transparent, pragmatic approach, we can't necessarily count on the same thing from Russia or China. And of course, it could be a very powerful tool that could be wielded to achieve a country's particular interests if they wanted to use leverage of deployment of these technologies. In fact, seeing this problem, the principal scientific advisor to the Indian government has argued that geoengineering could end up concentrating power in rich countries, despite the risk that SRM could worsen droughts or intensify hurricanes in countries not party to their decision making. So there has been a lot of concern about the lack of action on the international governance level and the inconsistencies in terms of the scientific approach to these technologies in powerful countries right now. So now we get to the private sector where the majority of the research is being done. So private sector attention is growing. There are numerous startups around the world, many primarily in the United States and Israel. So there's a couple of different examples here. If you look at the pictures with the what look like weather balloons, this is an example of the work of Make Sunsets, which is based in the United States. They have done a number of different small scale test experiments. And I think it's important to note, and this was actually covered in an NPR report a few weeks ago, that Make Sunsets is a very, very small startup run by Luke Eisman, who is kind of a Silicon Valley entrepreneur. And they actually don't have any scientists on staff at the moment. But they did launch some balloons from Mexico to inject sulfur into the atmosphere to offset carbon emissions. The final location of the balloons and the findings of whether this experiment worked or what its objectives were never made public. The Mexican government was also not consulted and then announced a ban on solar geoengineering activities. Founder Luke Eisman reportedly said, "I don't think waiting for an institutional review board is acceptable in this situation." So we have kind of different standards between the scientific community and the private sector community. Now, other options include Ethos Space, which is an LA-based startup, which is planning to build a planetary sunshade in space to protect the Earth. That would be a challenge given the international cooperation that would be required. We do have an outer space treaty, and how would this sunshade affect, potentially different countries, different regions? Other companies include AMR, which is a Swiss company, which their chief executive argued that governance and also indigenous communities are stopping one of the most promising climate technologies with their wariness. Wariness now is our biggest problem. We have to try it and then we'll know. Now, one organization that is actually funded primarily through philanthropy that is trying to address this kind of issue of research and expertise and funding all being concentrated primarily in developed countries in the global north is the Degrees Initiative. And so the Degrees Initiative is actually supporting developing country research and evaluation for solar radiation modification, including reaching out to scientists in the developing world, providing technical training for scientists, basically trying to increase the capacity in the developing world to conduct this research. But there are a lot of countries in the developing world that are highly skeptical of this approach, and they worry that they are kind of being taken advantage of because they have, a greater need for resources, and therefore they might be used as kind of unintentional guinea pigs in this kind of research. Other scientists have also voiced concerns about this so-called tyranny of urgency, that they argue that solar geoengineering is portrayed as one of the only realistic pathways to move forward towards such aspirational goals. And Holly Buck, an assistant professor at the University of Buffalo, said, "There are plenty of people on the front lines of climate change that are in far more danger than these people in Palo Alto, and they are not going out and shooting things into the sky." So for people who have a certain sense of ego, possibly a savior complex, a certain need to play a role in a great drama that's unfolding, they have the ability to rationalize the story and their place in the narrative. We instead need a whole of society transformation, not an individualized response. So right now, in fact, there was just a story the other day that is asking for the Commerce Department to play a more important regulatory role here. Apparently, a US company or citizens with plans to inject aerosols into the atmosphere is only required to fill out a one-page form with the Commerce Department 10 days before they do so, which is a result of the law from the 1970s regarding weather balloons. And Make Sunsets was addressed in this article about the Commerce Department. And apparently Make Sunsets didn't even fill out their one-page form with the Commerce Department until I believe it was about 10 days after their experiment. So after their activities were banned in Mexico, they've tended to move to places in the United States. It tends to be places like Nevada, and some of these balloons have been launched over Native American reservations. Which brings us to the role of civil society. So unfortunately, many climate ventures are developed on sensitive lands or waterways without tribal approval. And many of the tribal groups that are opposed to this call this green colonialism. The Sami Council shut down a solar geoengineering project that was actually supported by Harvard, ScopeX, for environmental concerns and lack of consultation. And this kind of just illustrated a long history of private companies' general disregard of tribal authority. So, and in fact, Harvard, as they were closing down their ScopeX report, kind of emphasized this, that there was a need for scientists to engage meaningfully with local communities that could be affected by geoengineering projects. There are other civil society projects like Hands Off Mother Earth, which is a civil society campaign against geoengineering. They have 195 organizations from 45 countries that have signed on to their manifesto. And their main theme is that geoengineering perpetuates the false belief that today's unjust, ecologically and socially devastating industrial model of production and consumption cannot be changed, and that therefore we need techno fixes to tame its effects. And what Asa Larsa Blind, the vice president of the Sami Council, noted was, what we do oppose the direction towards technologies that do not actually target the root of climate change, and the great amount of resources that are put into what could be seen as feeding the idea of a quick fix and overbelief in technology being the main solution, also then taking away the importance of the parallel transition of a society towards a more sustainable way of living. We cannot downplay the need for change, and we need to realize the solution to this crisis is the change of social structures. So at the end of the day, this comes back to this question of who should bear responsibility and the costs of addressing climate change. As you can see here with this map, that like most of the developed world, has the greatest number of per capita CO2 emissions. And so they really kind of are unfairly contributing more than their share to our atmosphere of CO2 emissions. And the Tuvalu foreign minister was trying to make this point in a speech at COP 2016, or sorry, at COP 26, that any discussion about climate change, any efforts to address, climate overshoot will have to engage with this imbalance, both in responsibility and resources and capabilities between the global north and the global south. R.T. Gupta, who's a professor of global environmental governance at the Netherlands, has argued, our concern is that there has been very little discussion, and this risky idea is getting normalized, even though it's only a small group of people, primarily in the global north, and some tech investors pushing this idea. And I think if you've been following the news over the last couple of months, you'll see that when I started working on this topic in January, there's very little discussion about this in the mainstream press. But over the past few months, it has been increasingly gaining more attention, which really kind of validates these concerns that we're seeing more and more discussion of what many scientists consider a risky, marginal, and an unwise investment of our limited funds to address the urgent issue of climate change. So that leaves us with what can we do? So there are actually a lot of realistic alternatives and investments that we can make in addressing climate change that would be more fruitful and would help address overshoot than necessarily solar radiation modification. So these include adaptation projects and increasing resources in climate finance. We can continue to work out phase out of production and consumption of fossil fuels, provide greater assistance to developing countries to ensure access to clean energy technology, and continue to work on adaptation, which includes international finance, policy support, global efforts to achieve early warning programs, address climate mobility, and increase agricultural resistance. Um, Another point that I think is really important is that we need to focus more on women. The International Center for the Research on Women notes that 80% of the people who will be displaced by climate change are women, yet only 0.2% of climate financing goes to women. And they point to some really important projects that could be helpful in achieving measurable outcomes. So the first they highlight is Solar Sister, which gives assistance to green energy entrepreneurs who sell diverse alternative energy projects to last mile communities and have removed 1 million tons of carbon in 10 years. They also cite Project Dandelion, which is a movement that focuses on the intersection of climate justice. And just kind of a final point that I want to make is that what's really important is that we listen to Indigenous people and small island developing nations who will be affected most by climate change. Um, we need some kind of greater effort to bring Indigenous leaders together to develop solutions to the climate crisis and achieving climate justice. Right now, it feels like in this debate, we're very focused on the lab science and almost the hypothetical science. And we're forgetting that people have lived with varying climate conditions for hundreds of years and have this innate knowledge that could be really helpful in finding those kinds of practical solutions to things like climate overshoot. I will stop there and ask if you have, and I'm sure that Kate has collected many, many questions for us.
Yeah, and just a reminder, continue to put questions into the Q&A. And I think that's a great segue into this first question, because I think you're talking about some of these organizations. But the question is there any reputable group starting from a vision of a world with human rights for all, then using that to link climate change responses to other responses necessary to create that world?
That's a great question. You know, I don't have a specific group that I can point to, but I think there are a lot of groups like the International Center for Women for Research on Women that is trying to address this issue. And I will say, I think the report from the UN Human Rights Council was a real mobilizing point for some of these groups. So I would guess that if someone wanted to go and find that go to the UN Human Rights Council's website and find that report, they would probably find a number of organizations that contributed to that report, and that would be a really good place to start to look for those groups.
You know, as you've been talking just about like who is responsible, you know, and you look at governments, you look at NGOs, you look at, you know, organizations that span different countries, and then the private sector. And I don't know if you saw the movie Don't Look Up, but it's a movie about the impending you know, destruction of Earth because of a meteor heading towards Earth, and just trying to find the tensions across those different sectors. And I'm just wondering, how do we work globally for some of these things that are impacting us globally when we have such mindsets that are so either local or self-serving?
This is a really difficult issue, and that's why I raised the tragedy of the commons. And this is a difficult question with no simple answer, right? I think in the past, when we've dealt with global issues, and I really point back to the Montreal Protocol, which was created after the discovery of the ozone hole, both scientists and actual corporate entities like came together to recognize that CFCs were the source of the problem and that there would need to be some development of alternatives. So I think scientists, and I think a lot of scientists are calling to each other in this debate to say, hey, we really need to come out of the lab and understand our important role in educating policymakers about what we can do, what are the risks, what are the benefits. I think the challenge that scientists are facing right now, particularly with solar radiation modification, is that they just don't have the resources, right, that a lot of these Silicon Valley tech entrepreneurs have. And on the one hand, this is a difficult thing to navigate because on the one hand, those entrepreneurs have been successful because they have been willing to take big risks, right? And that's what they do. But I think these scientists are saying it's one thing to take a big risk to develop Facebook, right? Or it's one thing to take a big risk to invest in electric vehicles. It's another thing to take a big risk with a kind of global deployment of a technology that in a venue that doesn't respect boundaries, right? And that's where I think everyone is acknowledging that the UN, which is really just a collection of states, is only going to have the ability to manage this dialogue if powerful states are engaged, right? And that's where, again, the difficulty with the tragedy of the commons is that you need everyone to participate, but you really need those big emitters to participate. So if we could get those big emitters to participate, which is what the UNFCCC has been trying to do with their yearly conferences, then you can make some progress, right? Because if the US says we're going to participate, if the EU says we're going to participate, it becomes harder for China and India to say that they won't, right? So yeah, it's a really difficult issue and there's no good solution to it because there is no, we wouldn't even want to have like an authoritarian world government, which would be the only way that you could enforce a mandate to overcome these tragedy of the commons issues.
Well, and the big emitters, they also have, I guess, you'd think that they would be looking at these solutions because they're easier fixes maybe than changing behaviors of people.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's exactly the argument. So I've heard this argument many times that solar radiation modification is attractive because it is relatively less expensive. And that's only true if you look at it in a vacuum, right? Because it will cost $100 billion every year to continue with solar radiation modification. And that will trade off with climate finance, with adaptation, right? It's not like we have this infinite pool of money. And the other challenge with that is if that's the focus and we're not doing the hard work of CO2 emissions reductions, then we're still going to have to do that eventually at some point, right? So it seems like a cheap option, but you're eventually still going to have to come back and do the hard thing. And so again, this is what scientists, particularly in the developing community, are really worried about. It's like this looks shiny and easy, but at the end of the day, not only could it have negative consequences for us, but it's also not going to solve this bigger problem. And so I haven't seen Don't Look Up, but Snowpiercer, which is kind of this movie that talks about the after effects of a failed solar radiation modification project, you know, that that's a scary world to think about. And so we really, and again, who has control of the technology is really important. And we can see an analogy with this in nuclear weapons, right? If at the end of World War II, there was this opportunity to centralize nuclear technology at the United Nations, it was something the US was in support of, but ultimately the Cold War dynamic took over. But now we have this technology that's out there and it's very hard to put the genie back in the bottle. And so I think a lot of right now, solar radiation modification research is still a relatively small enterprise. Like we're talking in the context of like billions of dollars going into different climate research. We're talking in the millions here still. But I think scientists are concerned the more this gets talked about in mainstream media, the more this is talked about by policymakers, the more it gains traction, when really the majority of scientists are very skeptical. And it will take at least it's decades away from being deployed, right? Again, so would we be better off to invest those funds in things like adaptation?
And you did say too, I mean, the unintended consequences, we can't do experiments. So we really don't know what the outcome is. And you kind of think about, all of our history, like the mongoose in
Hmm.
Hawaii, introducing that to control rats, and then it becomes the problem. And it's just,
Hmm.
it's a very hard, slippery slope, perhaps.
Yes, and this there's actually a very concrete example that can illustrate how little we understand the complexity of the climate. So for a long time, Dubai has actually been using cloud seeding to address water shortages. And so it doesn't rain very often in Dubai. There's not and so they've done this cloud seeding, and just I think maybe a week and a half ago they had this torrential rain. They got like a year's worth of rain in a day. Now, they say they weren't cloud seeding before that, and they probably weren't. It was the storm was forecast in advance. But you have to wonder, once we start messing with something as complex as the climate, what are the long-term effects? And the reality is we will probably only know that in retrospect, right? As we observe the climate and we collect more data. It's very hard. I think climate scientists are very reluctant. They know in general terms what our future is going to look like as the climate warms, but I think they're very cautious about making these kinds of short-term predictions. So again, we're manipulating things and we may not know the full effect of it.
So we have another question here. There's another approach being taken that sees climate change as inevitable and finding ways to adapt to the change by developing crops resistant to change, et cetera. What are your thoughts about this?
So I think I have two thoughts about this. One is that I think adaptation is a very practical solution that will benefit people's lives, because climate change is inevitable. I mean, we are going to warm. And so we do need to adapt. We need to adapt crops. We need to think seriously about refugees. We need to think seriously about sea level rise. We also need to think seriously about how the oceans will change. Um, that is all, I think, important because it will have a material effect on people. I do think that to a certain degree, it trades off with this very difficult conversation about, social change, about how do we change the way our society approaches the earth, right? Um, I think scientists would argue those conversations need to go hand in hand. And I think adaptation is a hard conversation, but it's very practical and pragmatic, and I think necessary. Um, but we are going to get to a point where the social change conversation is going to still be there and actually be pretty critical. And so I think those two conversations have to happen in parallel, and there's a temptation for them not to. So I would never argue against adaptation. I think adaptation is essential. People are going to die, right, if we don't seriously work on adaptation. On the other hand, it's like, let's make sure we're keeping this other conversation going of like, because ultimately we want to, I think you and I might want to say everyone should have a fair standard of living. No one should live in poverty, right? All of those things are things we would want for everyone. But if everyone had that, we could easily overwhelm the earth, right? We might not have enough resources to do that. So then that's the question, well, how do we address that, right? And one possibility is like, well, maybe we would have to change our way of living. That's a hard conversation to have, but I think it's also an inevitable conversation. And I think the more we put it off, the harder it's going to be.
Well, and I think that gets to the whole climate justice. And when you think about rising
Hmm.
sea levels and island nations that, are going to be losing, perhaps be
Hmm.
totally underwater with the changes
Hmm.
and definitely, I mean, the weather patterns that we're seeing are not impacting everyone the same.
Hmm. Yeah,
So
absolutely. Yeah, and I think it's also really like we have not. It's been interesting over the past 10 years. I've had a lot of students. We at St. Ben's and St. John's are very lucky that we actually have observer status at the UN Climate Change Conference. And so our students go every year. And so I've been watching this refugee conversation change and grow over time. And I think it's very difficult because people don't want to leave their homes, right? People don't want to leave their way of life. They also have very different views on climate change and what causes it and how they want to deal with it. Those conversations need to be happening. And again, it comes back to who's responsible. The conversation about migration is a difficult one in the United States and Europe and other places. On the other hand, but if we're responsible for creating this problem, should we not also be responsible for assisting the people who are harmed by it? So yeah, I mean, climate justice is all tied up in this. And I think what organizations like the International Center for Research in Women are arguing is like, let's not lose sight of the people who are impacted when we have these conversations about climate change. And let's not lose sight of the fact that we could still do things. We could do little things. They're small, but that doesn't mean they're totally insignificant, right? They make a difference for the people who are affected by them.
yeah, it reminds me of the Dust Bowl, and we had climate refugees leaving Oklahoma and going to California, and they were not embraced either. So, I mean, that was even within our own country with our own citizens. So it is a complicated issue. So
Absolutely.
I have another question here. The Earthshot Prizes, created and funded by Prince William, award small, inventive efforts across the world and continue funding them and scaling up and moving up for more influence. Are there any other influential wealthy people offering similar support that you know of?
That's a great question. So I will say, someone asked me about Elon Musk, and being a skeptical person, I was sure he supported solar radiation modification, which he actually doesn't. He's working a lot more on renewable energies. So I don't know that he has projects like that, but he is doing a lot of that research. I will say that unfortunately, a lot of people who you might expect, so Bill Gates, and Jeff Bezos have somewhat jumped on the solar radiation modification train. And so it's concerning to me, just how much money, even though it's comparatively smaller to the whole context of what we'll need, but unfortunately a lot of money is still that could make a difference with projects like adaptation and climate finance, is going into this technological research. So the Earthshot Prize is fantastic and a great model. And I think but I don't know of any others that are necessarily working like that to do climate adaptation. The Paris Accords set up a climate financing goal, to support projects like that, and but unfortunately, the goals of that fund, the amount of donations to that fund have not been met.
Mhm. Yeah, so we're not necessarily seeing some of the investment in innovation that we could be seeing.
Mhm.
So I have another question here that climate change is a crisis of human greed and lust for consumption. Self-awareness is the only starting point towards becoming more mindful of how our actions and habits may harm the earth. What are your thoughts about that?
I agree. I think I think there are ways that we can think about our own lives, and how we can change our own habits and our own consumption. But I think we have. it's very easy to look at a huge global issue like climate change from an individual's perspective and be overwhelmed. I do think it's important to remember that while driving an electronic vehicle or an electric vehicle, making other changes, trying to reduce your use of single-use plastics, all of those things are good, right? But the amount of CO2 that's emitted by large corporations is always going to swamp what we as individuals do. So we have to kind of take a both and approach, take responsibility, try and change our behavior as much as I can. I have a very good friend who really doesn't, he tries not to fly. But we're always going to be kind of making difficult choices like that because we as individuals lack, all the different resources. We can push for things like greater public transportation, that would certainly help. But I think we also need to push policymakers to ensure that regulation is forcing corporations to make those changes because those are your large scale emitters. So we can definitely make changes on ourselves as individuals, and I think that's good, but it can be overwhelming if you think you're the only one, right? And so I think going back to collaborating with others, and doing small local changes, when President Trump withdrew the US from the Paris Accords, there were Michael Bloomberg still led an effort to work with cities and states to continue to try and help the US meet their Paris Accord goal. Um, cities, and I know a lot of colleagues who do important work on the role of cities and states in reducing CO2 emissions. So it doesn't only have to be, kind of trying to go up against big corporations. It can be looking at maybe small businesses in your community. How does your state regulate different corporations? So there's ways to kind of take action at multiple levels.
And you think about too, I mean, even at the neighborhood level, like solar gardens and just people
Hmm.
coming together around some of those. We do have a course that we offer through Ollie, taught by someone named Fred Rose, who was with our Institute in the Environment here. And he has a whole tool that helps you look at like where do you get the most bang for your buck in making some changes, like eating less meat, you
Hmm.
electrifying things, you trying to find clean grids and so solar
Hmm.
panels and things like that. And so you can put in some of the changes you're willing to make and look at which ones are going to have the biggest impact. But I think you're right that it's overwhelming and people feel like I'm recycling, but is that plastic really getting recycled? And
Hmm.
and how do we reduce it to begin with? But as an individual, that's a really tough thing.
Absolutely. And I will say that there are ways, and I've seen this where, I really try to reduce the amount of single-use plastics that I use, but you can't help it. Like if you're eating healthy, sometimes those things are packaged in plastic. You'd be surprised at like efforts at pressuring those organizations to change their packaging can make a big difference. And in the United States, we're very lucky. I lived in Ireland for 6 months when I was leading a semester abroad, and it was amazing to me how all the fruit and produce was wrapped in plastic, and I thought that was really strange. So, shopping at your farmer's market if you have access to it. I had a student who worked on a policy proposal that farmers markets would accept EBT, and that actually happens now, which I think is fantastic. But if there's something that's you are like, I need to buy this and it's not packaged in a way I like, write the company,
Mhm.
or get your neighbors together to try and address it. And that can't hurt, right? Will it work? Maybe, maybe not, right? But I think a lot of companies are feeling pressured to kind of align with the public interest, but they only feel that pressure if they know that people are watching them.
And sometimes, are they really making those changes or are they just using terminology to make you think that that's the case?
Right. And I think what's important with recycling and PBS NewsHour did a great program on this. I've also heard some really good podcasts. The issue with recycling is that we as individuals were duped into thinking it's our fault, it's our responsibility, but really the corporations that produce these projects are benefiting cost-wise by choosing a less costly and then saying, well, it's on you to recycle when some of these things actually aren't recyclable. So like I think it's I still recycle, right? I'm still going to do the best I can, but I think we also, need to continue to try to either seek out alternatives that are packaged in ways that are more friendly to the environment or continue to put pressure on producers because that's really where change would happen, right? Like you and I can individually recycle, but the producer could change the way they package items. And yeah, it's easy to be cynical. And I students, I think, having gone through COVID and with all of this polarization that's in media, are very cynical. And I kind of say, let's not be too cynical, right? Like amazing things have happened because people have been active in arguing for them to happen. And they certainly won't happen if people don't ask at all. And
Mhm.
so I think we have to keep that little tiny grain of optimism that people can make a difference.
Yeah, because if you don't have that hope, well, then you just look at adaptation and, we've given up and, it's just,
Yeah.
we need to believe that we can change it and we need
Hmm.
some signs that we actually can.
And I think that's what one of the quotes that I read from a scientist kind of skeptical of solar radiation modification was getting at is like the people who are on the front lines of this, the people who are being impacted by this aren't saying, let's try solar radiation modification, right? They're saying, let's think about adaptation, let's think about how we can make our community more resilient. And so as long as those people are advocating for those policies, then I don't feel like I can say, well, we'll just give up, you know? So I think it's really important that people who are most impacted by this are still trying to argue for policy change.
Mhm. I have another question. If COP26's mission is to limit temperature increases to 2 degrees Celsius by mid-century, free marketers say that it will fail. What are your thoughts about that?
So yeah, actually, a member of my dissertation committee wrote a really good article about this because yeah, there have been a lot of articles that have come out lately saying good, we're not going to meet the Paris targets. We're all going, we're going way down into the road of climate change. And his argument was that it's good to have ambitious targets because it gives civil society organizations and scientists and other policymakers that push. Even if they can't hit the target, they should try to get as close to the target as possible. And so his argument was because we think right now given the science that we're not going to get to this ambitious target, that does not mean we should just give up on it. It's like we should continue to push. And if you think about the graph for overshoot, you know, once we overshoot, if we just say, well, we're stuck, we're just going to keep going higher and higher, right? The only way we get the bend that arc back to 1.5 is if we continue to make gains in reducing CO2 emissions. And that's something like solar radiation modification. It might make the world less hot. It's not going to address a lot of the other issues. And it doesn't bend that arc backward, right? Because we still have to do the hard work of reducing CO2 emissions to get the arc to bend backward to 1.5.
Mhm. So I have another question that is about sustainable economies versus free market. So
Mhm.
sustainable economy policies based on structured markets and government programs to maximize the well-being of all people and protect Earth's ecosystems, in direct contrast to the free market policies that maximizes average income and ignores income distribution and environmental degradation. What are your thoughts
Mhm.
about that?
So I would say I think that even so should we have sustainable economies? I think that would be great, right? I think it's very hard to imagine um, making that significant of the change in the United States very quickly, right? We see a lot of this kind of economic structures in Europe. We don't necessarily see those economic structures in the United States. However, I don't think all is lost because the free market, and I really point to insurance markets for this, insurance markets have to acknowledge that the effects of climate change are real and they are going to cause massive impacts that insurance companies could be on the hook for. And that's why you see big hedge funds, you know, acknowledging climate in their portfolios. They're like, well, we can't, there are places we can't invest in. We have to be concerned about investing in tourism. We have to be concerned about investing in certain communities or insuring certain communities. And what, and then people get really unhappy because you live on the Florida coast and you can't get insurance. And
Mhm.
that is insurance companies saying, we get it. Climate change is really expensive. Like we can see the impacts. So then the question is, what do you do about that? We have decided as a public, I think, in a lot of these places, that we're not going to leave people uninsured, but are we going to make those communities more climate resilient? Or are we just going to put the government on the hook for whatever damage inevitably occurs? And that's going to require more far-sighted policymakers, right? And also voters, right? Who are going to vote in far-sighted policymakers who are going to say, yeah, we want people to be able to live on land that they have. We want to support these communities that have existed in these places for a long time. But the solution isn't just to close our eyes and hope that the hurricane doesn't happen, right? The solution is how do we make these communities more climate resilient? And so I do think that there's a business case to be made for climate resilience. And I do think insurance companies are kind of the tip of this that we see. And so the free market depends on, profits and incomes and things like that. And it's inequitable, right? I'm not going to argue that it is, but I do think there are areas in which the earth has the final say. And this is one of those where I think even capitalism is not more powerful than the earth and then climate change. And so insurance companies are kind of the tip of this where they have to recognize that.
Mhm. And there is also some of that climate justice going on too, because, some of those areas that are, people can't get insurance are also, I mean, some of them are high income areas, but there's also low income
Hmm.
areas. And so having to
Yep.
pay more for insurance or, paying more for food because we have it sustainably packaged, doesn't impact everyone the same way either. So there's tension
Yep.
there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's where it's really important for people working at the community level to know their community and to talk to their community about what they need and to be honest with them about what's possible, right? Like being able to live your life the way you've always lived it on the Florida Gulf Coast is probably not an option, right? But what are the ways we could preserve people's ways of life? And I think also what communities get prioritized and what communities don't get prioritized, and that is another big issue. And there's a lot of areas in which the free market is going to fail, right? It's especially going to fail in the short term because markets just don't adjust that quickly. That's where we need um, policymakers who answer to people, right? To say, okay, we have this issue, we're going to have to figure out how to intervene because we see this problem in the short term that maybe the market will figure out in the long term, but they're not going to figure it out in the short term.
And it is hard for us with so many issues floating out there that impact how people vote, just to bring in
Hmm.
policymakers who prioritize this.
Yeah, it's really hard to have those single issues, but this is something where I think working at the local community, these issues may be more top of mind than your senator, your state level representatives. And so I think the more local community politicians learn and invest in kind of understanding what's going on in their communities, especially those communities that are vulnerable, then they can be better advocates for their communities up the chain.
Mhm. I have another question. The UN climate chief presses for faster action, says humans have 2 years left to save the world. Do you want to comment on your thoughts about that? Do we really have 2 years left to save the world?
Yeah, I think these kinds of pronouncements are always tricky because I think you want to create a sense of urgency, but then some of the scientists who are concerned about solar radiation modification see that urgency as feeding into, let's just try everything, let's throw spaghetti at the wall and see what works without really acknowledging the kinds of differential impacts that would have. So I think I understand why people are trying to ring the alarm bell. Um, but I think it is not always helpful. In some ways, like in the ways that my colleague Asim Prakash sees the benefit of ambitious climate goals, I think that's maybe like the positive approach to it. I think and I don't want to say it's fear mongering because the fear is real, and it will have real impacts people in the next 2 years. I think for the developed world, for the United States, we probably have more time to deal with it than Tuvalu, right? And so I, I'm not, I have not seen policymakers yet be compelled by the ringing the fire alarm in this way on climate change. And so I think what we saw with the ozone layer was a lot of concern, right? But also just more collaboration amongst people of like, what are the solutions? And to be fair, that was a somewhat easier problem because they were dealing with chlorofluorocarbons. It was very clear climate change has a multiplicity of causes. But I think there has to be, I'm not, I understand why they're raising that fire alarm, and maybe there's a benefit to that, but I think it has to be paired with what are the pragmatic things we can do now so that people don't just feel overwhelmed and give up. Because I think that's sometimes can be a response to that kind of approach.
Yeah, the despair.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which
Yeah.
is real. And, I know that there's been some literature too, especially with young adults and mental health impact of
Mhm.
climate despair.
Absolutely. And I see that with my students. And I just tell them, I'm like, there are things that can be done. There are lots of people all around the world who are much more vulnerable than we are, who are still, fighting for change, trying to make their community safe. And then that's where I think at the lower scale, there's so much more work that can be done. Like we can learn so much more about adaptation. And that's pragmatic and real and will save lives. um, Investing in these techno fixes. And I mean, there's there's a benefit to that, but everything's about trade-offs, right? We don't have infinite resources in the world. And so and I think a lot of the scientists and I think a lot of the civil society activists are saying, yes, we want CO2 reductions. That's what's happening in the developed world. That's your responsibility. We need adaptation. We need real ways that we can cope with what's coming at us in the next 10 to 20 years.
Mhm. I have another question. Depending on the SRM approach changes in stratospheric ozone and surface UV radiation, and acid rain and unintended climate changes such as altered temperature and precipitation patterns or excessive cooling. So what are, you talked about those different approaches that could be taken.
Mhm.
Do you see any differences in predicted um, impact on radiation, acid rain, unintended consequences, and temperature precipitation patterns?
I think it's really hard to know, like when you talk about the planetary sunshade and the stratospheric injections, I think that's really hard to know. There are some smaller regional experiments with stratospheric injections, but those experiments are mainly can we create the particulates the size that would be needed to create clouds? I do think that there's probably a lot more science and years of experience in regional cloud seeding. And so that's always going to have a regional effect. But again, it comes back to this issue of anytime you're tweaking with the climate, you just don't necessarily know what those follow-on effects are going to be. So I think that's why I kind of hesitate because on the one hand, I'm very skeptical of SRM. On the other hand, I think there might be lots of things we can find in that research that might be practicable and short of a global type implementation, right? And so at my alma mater at University of Washington, they're doing a really big cloud seeding project that was covered in a NOVA documentary, I think from 2018. You know, I think in that case, maybe that kind of regional level thing that's not having the bigger impacts, that could be really productive. I want scientists to continue to learn, right? But I think it's also very important that scientists are the ones who continually are asking these ethical and governance questions. And so I'm like, if scientists have money to do this research, I think there can be some benefits to it. So I don't want to say there's none. But I also still think there are like real world priorities that we need to make sure are attended to. And I think we have to be very, very cautious. Like you said, with mongoose and other kinds of things, we thought, oh, we have the answer. And kind of our arrogance, human arrogance, in thinking that we understand the complexity of our earth is has not served us well always. And so I think we should be, and I think scientists are finally recognizing that, right? Like we need to be really cautious here. And that's what worries me about some of these private sector initiatives that don't have extensive involvement of scientists, because I think that's those scientists are trained both in their techniques, but I think they also acknowledge like we need to think about not just can we do this, but is it a good idea? And so, yeah, I really want scientists to take the lead on this conversation.
Well, and also, I mean, there is this expectation for scientists to build a body of knowledge, to share findings, to build on each other, to replicate. If you've got proprietary work happening, then it's in a closed system and you're not necessarily building on, what other people have learned through the process.
Exactly. The more we can collaborate and have transparency, something like what Eisenhower imagined for nuclear research with Atoms for Peace, we need this kind of transparency, sharing of information. This is something that the UN can manage, right? The UN is very good at bringing together people, sharing information, creating a repository for information that people can access around the world. What the UN is less good at is stopping countries from doing things that they think they want to do. It can be done, but it's not easy, right? And so, and the more we can encourage transparency and collaboration, then hopefully everyone's having this ethical conversation in parallel with scientific advances.
And it's also maybe shifting our view that we are global citizens, and
Yeah.
we need to be all in this together because we are.
Yeah, and I think then, and this is what I think the Harvard scientists learned. I don't think they went into their project trying to, marginalize Indigenous people, but I think what they learned is that being a global citizen means talking to the people in the communities that are who have lived in these communities for a long time and have made observations that might be really useful to your scientific knowledge. So kind of thinking about human knowledge as being on a similar level to what we think of scientific knowledge. Because at the end of the day, all science is done by humans. And so we're always interpreting things. So there's no way to get rid of that kind of human interpretation and perspective. And so bringing in different perspectives, I think, is really important.
And bringing it beyond the journal, the articles.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, that's one thing. I have a student now who is doing a Fulbright, and I've been helping her as she thinks about what she wants to do forward. And she said one of the most impactful things she's heard through her journey is that we need more scientists in policy.
Mhm.
And we do because we can't be stovepiped. We can't have that expertise be kind of utilized by politicians without understanding its context.
Mhm.
Yeah,
And dialogues like this too, bringing in,
absolutely.
academic person, but having your audience learn from you.
Absolutely. And I think the more like the one thing I will say that gives me hope is the more we can have dialogue about these issues and even ask these really hard questions like, is our way of life sustainable? Even if I don't completely change my way of life, I might change a few things about my life that then have follow-on effects, right? And so I think the more we can just learn from each other, the better.
Mhm.
And so that's one thing that I think international governance can do really well is bring people together to have conversations like this.
Mhm. I have another question. The most common concern about SRM is that its research and evaluation might undermine reductions of greenhouse gas emissions. What are your thoughts about that?
Um, so that's a real issue. So I have a graph in front of me that just looks at it's created by the World Economic Forum and it tracks total climate research funding from 1990 to 2026. And so we see kind of fits and starts with climate research funding. But what we see is like an increasing section of this funding is going to geo and climate engineering. And actually, a very small amount of this funding is going to research on industrial decarbonization, which is, I think, like I said, that's where we're going to see the real impacts from reducing CO2 emissions. Um, so I think I would be like all hands on deck, let's do everything. I have no objection to that except that we have limited resources. So my thoughts are that I worry that solar radiation modification trades off with other adaptation or decarbonization research. Now, some people might say, well, but if private sector people want to put their money into SRM, that's their right, and it is. But I think that's when you get into these projects that are largely unregulated and also, we were talking about the free market and sustainable economy is, when you have these innovations happening in the private sector, they have an economic motive, right? Not necessarily a public interest motive. And so I think we have to have really difficult conversations given that we have limited resources. And I think a lot of scientists argue we need to do the hard thing. We need to focus on CO2 emissions. We need to reducing CO2 emissions. We need to focus on adaptation. Like the shiny thing is nice and it seems like a cheap, like I read that a lot, a cheap option, but it's not cheap because you do that in addition to the hard things that you're avoiding doing. So that's what I fear.
Mhm. So we are coming towards the end. So I just, before we wrap up, I wonder if you could give any advice to people on this call about just what steps do you think they should be taking to support some of um, the movement to deal with climate change?
Yeah, I think I would recommend looking, I think looking at yourself, looking at your own practices, there are a lot of things you can do. Like you recommended the resources that exist through your institution. You can do that individually, but also just have conversations with people in your community, have conversations with people who of different ages. And then see, are there projects you can do in your community that might help people, right? Like a community garden that might provide produce for people so they don't have to buy produce that's packaged in single-use plastics. Especially because, like, I think farmers markets are fantastic, but they're not accessible to everyone, right? So do you help build a community garden or you help fund a community garden, you know? Um, Lots of times we have different limitations with our time. And sometimes, you know, if you don't have time to volunteer, do things like that, your money still makes a difference to small community group. In fact, I would argue it makes more difference to small community groups. Like I know we're coming up with the election and there will be a million calls for donations for all kinds of political causes. And what worries me about that is that that money all goes into this like kind of really circular industry that we don't always like the outcome of, which is more political ads, more mailers, things like that that are not necessarily good for the environment. And so I want people to be politically active. I'm a political scientist after all, but I also think we should think about how can we communicate our interests in the climate, even if it's not our top voting issue? How can we communicate that interest to politicians seeking our support? And I think the more we talk about it, the more they have to think about it, right? And that I think is really helpful. And just, you know, even if it's not your top voting issue, thinking about where does it fit, you know, thinking yourself, where does this fit in my priorities, and talk to other people about that and where it fits in their priorities. I think those are great things that you can do.
Yeah, I know that a lot of people say, you know, change or it happens at the local level. I mean, starting there, starting with your neighborhood,
Mhm.
starting with your community garden, you know, those things you can do, talking to your representative, you know, making your voice heard.
And I think it builds confidence too. If you're not someone, you know, I've been involved in politics all my life, in one way or another. But if you're not someone who's comfortable with that, you know, doing those local things might help you build a community that you know you have confidence, you have expertise. Everyone has something to add to our conversations, right? And that might help you see where your voice is needed as well.
Mhm. Are there any books that you recommend?
Oh my goodness. Not off the top of my head. I really think um I really what my recommendation reading wise would be to read widely and read outside of maybe the zone in which we are comfortable. And so I'm a big reader of the Washington Post, the New York Times, but also the Atlantic. And just and I like to kind of look for things that are not necessarily things I agree with, but to try and understand that point of view.
Mhm.
And so no individual books come to the top of my mind, but I think just the more we can challenge ourselves, to be like, why do I really believe this? Or what do I really think about that? The better off we'll all be.
Mhm. Well, thank you so much, Christy. This has been an informative presentation. I also want to thank Grayson Simmons, who's been in the background providing behind the scenes help today. And we have another great decision session coming up on Friday, June 28th. We will be featuring Henry Berman, who's going to be speaking about Mideast realignment. And as I mentioned, you can find this recording on our YouTube station as well as Ramsey County. So thank you so much. This was just a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate it. And, you know, now we have some thoughts about how we can bring this into our own lives.
Great. Thank you all.
All right. Thank you.